Hello, sixth grade. We are going to spend the next 3 weeks reading our doing our final reading from our history book, and we're going to read together. So every week, you guys are going to have reading that's due. I'm going to post the video of me reading the chapter. I'd like you to read along with me. You can read on your screen and listen, do a split screen, or you can just listen and then read again on your own later. But I would like you to listen to each chapter, and then there will be a Google form at the end of each and just a couple of questions to answer. That would be your friend Cruz, who almost just knocked my computer off. Good thing he didn't. All right. Chapter 1, A Nation of Immigrants. A mixture of peoples. He is currently chasing his tail. I thought you guys would enjoy that. You caught it. Hello? Cruz. Okay. This has already been a really fun video, huh? All right. A Nation of Immigrants. A mixture of peoples. By the year 2060, the population of the United States is expected to grow more than 400 million people. With the exception of Native Americans, the people who live in the United States are generally the descendants or immigrants themselves. No wonder one historian wrote, "The history of America is immigration." Another scholar makes the same point in a different way. He offers this prediction: 300 or 400 years from now, future historians will find it hard to believe that back in the 1800s or 1900s, people from different continents and dozens of different countries would come together to form a nation that would not only survive, but would become a shining example to the rest of the world. North America has been home to Native Americans for thousands of years. In many ways, they were the first immigrants. But the story of immigration to America, as we tell it today, begins with Europeans who started colonies in North America. You may not have thought of the settlers of colonial Jamestown, Plymouth, and Massachusetts Bay Colony as immigrants, but they were. So were the thousands of other colonists who settled throughout the 13 British colonies, and so were the thousands or more who settled in Spain's colonies in the southwestern part of today's United States. You may remember that even in those early years, settlers in America came from many different lands. Most were from England, but there were Germans, Dutch, Scots, Irish, Scots who had been living in Northern Ireland, Swedes, Finns, French, Swiss, and others as well. And of course, there were those many, many thousands of Africans who were forced to come to the Americas against their will. For about half a century after independence, from the 1700s through the 1820s, immigration to America slowed down. There were two main reasons why. One was because during many of those years, European colonies or countries were at war with one another, and they fought each other on the sea as well as on land, and they didn't care much about anyone who got in the way. That made traveling on the oceans dangerous. Anyone thinking of Europe to live in America would have to think twice before making that voyage. The second reason was that those same warring nations made it difficult for their citizens to leave. The governments believed that losing population would weaken their ability to carry on wars, and several European governments tried to stop immigration altogether. Eventually, though, both of those barriers fell. By the 1830s, the movement of immigrants to America became a steady stream. In 20 years after that, it became a mighty river. How mighty? Think of this. By 1860, just before the start of the Civil War, more than 1 out of 8 persons living in the United States, 1 out of 8, was born somewhere else. So right now, if you look at the graphs on your page for page 5, as you can see, during this time period, most of the immigrants to the United States came from Ireland and Germany. After the Civil War, significant numbers of people from places such as Italy and Scandinavia came too. You can see right here that what year was the most? 1850. Thank you, Evan. You were correct. Just trying to make it more realistic. Why were so many people ready to give up everything familiar? Their hometowns and villages, often their families, and almost always their friends for a strange new land? Obviously, the reasons were not the same for all who came. In general, though, we can say there was a push and a pull in each person's decision to set off for America. The main push for most immigrants was economic. At that time, the great majority of people in every European country, as well as everywhere else in the world, was making a living by farming. Between 1750 and 1850, the population in Western Europe doubled, but the amount of farmland did not. That meant the farming communities had to make do with less land. Working on smaller plots, and remember, without the aid of modern fertilizers and farming equipment, families with farms found it harder and harder to grow enough food for their needs, even under the best of conditions. A bad turn in the weather, a crop disease, or anything that reduced the harvest could spell disaster for them. This is what happened to countless German farmers. Farming smaller lots of land, many of them began to slide into poverty in the 1830s. Some left for the nearby cities, but many were headed straight for the United States. Even some of the better off farmers left, for they could see how vulnerable they were. When crop failure struck in the 1840s, hundreds of thousands more German farmers left. The problem in Ireland was even worse. For years, Irish farmers survived to some extent by growing potatoes on tiny plots of rented land. In the 1800s, two disasters struck. One was the decision of landowners to convert their lands from growing crops to raising sheep, because fewer workers were needed to raise sheep than to grow crops. About 1 million Irish were thrown off the lands. More than half of them left for America in between 1815 and 1845. The second disaster struck in 1846. A disease known as potato blight wiped out nearly the entire crop for several years in a row. Starvation was everywhere. There will be nothing for us but to lie down and die, said one poor one. A person making a return visit to one Irish town in 1847 wrote about what he saw. Out of a population of 240 people, I found 13 already dead from want. The survivors were like walking skeletons, the men gaunt and haggard, stamped with the livid mark of hunger, the children crying with pain, the women in some of the cabins too weak to stand. Over the next several years, more than 1 million Irish left for America. When they were no longer needed to work the land, poor Irish farmers and their families were thrown out of their simple homes to fend for themselves. When the potato blight wiped out their main food source, with nowhere to live and nothing to eat, 1 million people died of starvation and disease. In a few countries, there was another economic push factor. In Great Britain and in some of the German lands, industrialization, I wonder if we'd study that yet, making goods in factories with the aid of machines had begun. In time, factories would mean more jobs, not fewer. But in the early stages of the factory system, machines replaced skilled workers, leaving them without jobs. Some took jobs in new factories, but many others chose to leave their homeland. Religious and political persecution for some were also push factors. Protestant groups such as the Mennonites and the Amish were eager to flee religious persecution in Germany. In addition, liberals who had supported the revolutions that swept through Europe in 1830 and 1848 often felt they had to leave after the revolutions failed. What about these pull factors that attracted so many of these people to America? What ideas did these future immigrants have about America, and where did they get them? Newspapers and books were two important sources of information. Europeans were extremely curious about this newest nations, and their newspapers regularly carried stories about life in the United States, as well as ads posted by American businessmen who had hoped to attract cheap European labor. Several hundred European visitors returned to write books about their travels. They even published guidebooks about new land in more than a half dozen languages. They're not fighting, they're just play fighting, which sounds like regular fighting. Addison! Because they know I'm making a video right now. And can you please get happy? This is really fun. Real fun, guys. You got a great video. More important, though, were letters written by relatives and friends who had already moved to America. These letters have come to be called the American letters. They were passed from one family member to another, and they were published in local newspapers and read aloud to groups that assembled in the village centers. Reading the words of these earlier immigrants, and you'll have no trouble understanding why a struggling European farmer or town worker would consider giving up everything and moving. From an Englishman in New Hampshire. We now have a comfortable dwelling and 2 acres of ground planted with potatoes, Indian corn, melons, etc. I have 2 hogs, 1 ewe, a female sheep, and a lamb. Cows in the spring were as high as $33, but no doubt I shall have one in the fall. From a Dutch woman in Massachusetts. Nearly all people eat 3 meals a day. Arnhem, a Dutch city, can't compare with it. One sees no poor here. Schools are free, there are no taxes, the finery is great. One cannot discern or see any difference between the cobbler's wife and the wife of a prominent gentleman. Nobody steals here, no night watchman. From a Norwegian in New York. Those who are willing to work will not lack employment or business here. It is possible for all to live in comfort and without want. From a German in Missouri. Tell Miriam there is no sending children to bed without supper or husbands to work without dinner in their bags. from a Swede in Illinois. This is a free country, and nobody has a great deal of authority over another. Nobody needs to hold his hat in his hand for anybody else. From a Welshman in New York. Dear wife, if you will let the two eldest boys come over to me for a while, it will be of great benefit to them. They will be taught for nothing until they are 14 years old. Here are the best schools in the world at the cost to the state. From a Norwegian in New York. Our son attends the English school and talks English as well as the native born. Letters like these led to the outbreak of what became to be called the American fever. Sometimes fever struck the entire village and carried away many of its residents to America. People from all over the world looked to this new country, and many did whatever they could to get there. And so by 1860, America had become the new home for so many. Of course, not all the letters home were so positive about America. Some immigrants reported back that they couldn't get jobs because they didn't know English. Others wrote that things weren't nearly as good as America as they expected them to be. And there were those who simply could not bring themselves to tell folks back home just how tough things were for them, and they said nothing at all. Such letters may have dampened enthusiasm for America for a while, but then would come another letter with money, perhaps as a gift to help relatives who had stayed behind, perhaps for buying a ticket to America. A single money order from a new American might be more than a European villager would see in years of hard work. American fever would rise all over again. By the 1850s, large steamships were replacing sailing ships, so the cost of traveling to America began to drop. It cost an English or Irish immigrant of that time only 1/4 as much to get to America as it had cost those from the same land 30 years before. And so they came, 2 million from Ireland, and another 600,000 from England, Wales, and Scotland. German immigrants numbered well over 1 million, and French, another 200,000. Norway, Sweden, the Netherlands, and Switzerland all provided many thousands of new Americans. During the years before the Civil War, 100,000 French Canadians came across the border into our northern states, while 40,000 Chinese arrived on our western shores. Some of these immigrants were driven by desperation, some by a desire to improve their lives, and some, no doubt, by a spirit of adventure, and surely some by the search for freedom and equality. Whatever their motive, they were brave souls, all of them, striking out boldly to start over in a strange new world.